It's a pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Adam Garfinkle. He's the editor of the American Interest magazine, based in Washington, D.C. He's also a Fox Fellow of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. That's not Fox News, that's Robert Fox, in case that matters to anybody. He got his PhD in international relations at the University of Pennsylvania, where he got started with FPRI back many years ago. He went on to become the chief writer of the U.S. Commission on National Security, 21st Century, editor of the National Interest magazine, and speechwriter for Secretary of State Colin Powell. He's the author of many books on international relations. He writes a regular blog for the American Interest magazine called The Middle East and Beyond. And we've asked him to speak on the fall of empires and the formation of the modern Middle East. Please welcome Adam Garfinkle.
Thank you very much for putting up with what I'm about to do. And I would love to know what I'm about to do, but I'm not sure. You heard a wonderful lecture to start off this program, and I wish that I could do as well, but you know, I have a disadvantage in this, in that I don't have a full-time academic position. I don't lecture on these kinds of subjects on a regular basis. So every time I do one of these programs, it's a one-off kind of effort. And one of the problems with that is I have to actually think about it, and I don't know how long it takes because I don't have any practice. So it ends up being kind of like a demolition derby in my head when I'm trying to do these things. So you'll have to forgive me if it's a lot more ragged than what Dr. Berkey was able to provide. The other thing is that this subject matter, the crumbling of empires, or the shattering of empires, and the formation of the modern Middle East, is, I think it's fair to say, kind of a large subject. Maybe not as large as the Middle East from the 7th century to the 18th, but still pretty large to try to handle in a half an hour or 40 minutes. And I think I had entertained a couple of options as to how to go about this in a way that would be useful to you. What I thought I would do first, but I've abandoned the idea, was to talk to you about pedagogy. Because in yesterday's New York Times, there was, I think, a very interesting article by David Brooks, my bud David Brooks, called Schools for Wisdom. So I'm not going to go over this, but if you haven't seen it yet, I urge you to read it. It's got some very useful observations for teachers at all levels, not just high school teachers. And then I was going to talk to you about ways to help your students achieve internal standards of excellence by using language in a precise way. But that's another pedagogical effort that I think I'm going to abandon because I just don't think I have time for it. I regret having to abandon it. But so let me just right into the substance. Then I had another problem. Do you really want to know, like every twitch and whatever, of what happened between, let's say, the onset of the First World War and the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire in its aftermath, and then the final congealing of an fully independent state system in the Middle East, which stretches essentially from 1914 to 1971, if you date the last independent rising in the region, which is in what used to be called the Trucial States, now the United Arab Emirates. But anybody can look up this chronology. I mean, what happened when is not particularly interesting, although it's complex in and of itself. A lot of stuff happened, but it's not. That would be the easy part. To me, the more interesting challenge in trying to explain the history of, say, the period from before the First World War until, the 40s, 50s, and 60s is to explain how intellectual currents, geopolitical considerations, social changes, and technological changes all mix together to produce the outcomes that we see. Now, this is a pretty tall order to try to do those things. And in order to do them effectively, I'd have to kind of assume that you know the basic chronology, what happened when, the sort of the easy part. But I was advised that may not be true. You may not really know all that kind of stuff. So it left me uncertain of how to go about it. But then came the other problem, which is that, the more I think about this stuff and the more I tried to formulate it for this talk, the more I realized that what I thought I knew 30 years ago, I'm not so sure I know anymore. You ever have the feeling that, you figured out something back when, and then when you revisit it in the light of a more mature evolution of your own soul and mind, that you don't actually like the way you understood something 25, 30 years ago? It happens to me all the time. All right, because I'm at that stage of my life now, as Kinky Friedman likes to say, where I'm too young for Medicare, but too old for women to care. It's a very confusing time of life, and it pervades everything that I'm just generally confused. But let me try to do the best that I can. I'd say there are three basic themes, so I'll give you the conclusions first. Three basic themes that you have to keep in mind when you're trying to get arms around a subject of such enormous girth as the crumbling of empires and the formation of the modern Middle East. The first is that historically, of course it's a wild generalization, but you have to generalize. Whenever a large political entity, an empire, shatters and crumbles, it creates a shadow belt of instability all around its periphery. And sometimes it requires many decades for the crumbling of empire, especially around the periphery, to reassemble itself into some kind of order. This can take a very, very long time. I think we see today in the modern Middle East, made up of 24 plus states, if you include the non-Arab states, still echoes of the destruction of the Ottoman Empire in World War I. This is not over yet. And of course, the destruction of other empires also has impinged on this phenomenon. In some ways before 1914, and in other ways since 1914, and in the case of Russia, both before and since 1914. So there are layers of imperial shatterings that produce compound effects in the modern world. It's not just, of course, in the Middle East that this happens. It happens everywhere that a great empire is brought to its knees. If we could just shift our attention for just a moment to Europe, I won't keep us there for long, I promise. I mean, if you look at the war, what's going on in Ukraine right now, you're seeing a replay, in some respects, though obviously not others, right, of the war between the young Soviet Union and Poland in 1920, 1921. Both episodes really follow a collapse of empire. In the first case, the Romanov Empire. In the more recent case, the Soviet Empire. And you're looking at an attempt from Moscow to reconsolidate some of the lost space from that imperial shattering. Now, I don't know anybody in the mainstream media in the United States that's ever drawn the analogy to the current Russian thinking and effort in Ukraine to the 1920-21 war between Soviet Union and Poland. But to me, it seems just as clear as an unmuddied lake that there's an analogy here. When it comes to the Middle East, when it comes to the Arab world and the non-Arab, the few non-Arab countries, important non-Arab countries in the region, Turkey, Iran, Israel, and depending on how you define the region, a few others. Again, you've got this compound effect over many years. And don't forget, when we think about the crumbling of empires and the emergence of the modern Middle East, we think mainly about the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, but that's a mistake. Don't forget, 4 empires died, as it were, in World War I. The Romanov Empire, 1917, you remember that. Well, not literally remember that, but you weren't around probably in 1917. The Habsburg monarchy, the Hohenzollern Empire, the German Empire, and of course the Ottoman Empire. And again, all 4 of these empires have affected the character of the modern Middle Eastern, so-called modern Middle Eastern system. There's one more thing to point out. If you're trying to lay out lines of causality in history, you have to, in order to do it properly, you have to go back pretty far in order to get a good running start on what caused what when. And this is a kind of an arbitrary enterprise in some respects because the tapestry of history doesn't have a lot of obvious breaks in it. You can go back a long way and find skeins of causality. But let's just take one. The Ottoman Empire, on the eve of the First World War, was already quite diminished from what it had been at its historical height. It had been weakened over many, many years. It had lost lots of territory at the hands of the Russian Empire, with whom the Turks fought many, many wars. also at the hands of the Habsburg monarchy, with whom the Turks fought many, many wars and lost a lot of them. And even, you can go all the way back in a way if you want, if you have a mind for this kind of thing. If you want to go back to 1571 and the Battle of Lepanto, a naval battle, that was also a limitation. The Ottomans lost that naval battle to a collection of Catholic powers led by Venice. That's another empire, not really an empire of all, so a fifth empire. Lost that naval battle, and what that did, one of the effects of that was to limit Ottoman power in the Mediterranean. And the effects of Lepanto echoed many, many, many years later when the Ottomans had a very difficult time holding on to parts of North Africa, which were in which they were suzerains, if not direct rulers, when the French in the 1880s came across the Med to Algeria and Tunisia and then later Morocco. So the seeds of the weakness that caused the rescission of the Ottoman Empire in North Africa were planted back in 1571. The Ottoman Empire, of course, as I think you know, was foremostly and first a European empire before it was a Middle Eastern empire. When the Ottomans first, in a serious way, knocked at the gates of Vienna in 1529, it was only a few years after the Ottomans had come into the heart of the Levant in the Middle East, really dates from 1517. And it was many years after 1517 before the Ottomans had consolidated their hold on what we today consider to be the Middle East. So the Ottoman Empire sort of ebbed and flowed, but it had been, the point is that it had been pretty seriously weakened by the early 20th century. Now, ironically, even though it had been weakened, in the 20 or 25 years or so, depending on how you look at this and who you read, the empire had been in reform mode, and it had been strengthened considerably. It had undertaken modernization of a whole range of governmental functions in the early 20th century. There had been the famous Young Turk revolt against Abdülhamid, and the government of the Ottoman Empire on the eve of the First World War and for some years before that was not the old-fashioned single ruler monarchical sultanate that it had been for most of its history. It was being run by something called the Committee for Union and Progress, the CUP, it's often referred to in the literature. And partly through its association with the rising Germany, but other European powers as well. Again, there have been lots of exchange, cultural, military, technological, and the Ottoman Empire was much stronger in 1912, 1913 than it had been 100 years before, including relative even to Europe. Nicholas II of Russia, I think is credited most of the time with being the author of the phrase "the sick man of Europe" to describe the Ottoman Empire. But of course, the Ottoman Empire outlasted Nicholas II. He turned out to be not only sick but actually quite dead before the end of the First World War. The Ottomans fought 4 years in World War I, and they put up a pretty good fight, not just at Gallipoli, as everyone knows very famously, but really throughout all the various fronts in which they fought hard, and they fought very well. If they were really the sick man of Europe, if they were that sick, they would not have been able to have done such a thing. So so there's an irony here. Yes, the empire was weak. It had been weakened. It had been diminished in size over many, many years, but it had gotten stronger on the eve of its final battle and its final collapse. It's one of those things that history can be satyrish in some respects. The second sort of basic theme that I think you need to know, aside from the shadow belt idea, is that institutions and attitudes live together in a necessary dialectical relationship. The legitimacy of empires is not a very easy concept for most young students or even most Americans to understand. We kind of, by second nature, assume the nationalist definition of self-determination as the one legitimate form of political authority. But as Dr. Berkey pointed out, this was just not true in earlier times. Empire was a legitimate and was felt to be a legitimate form of government in most parts of the world. And it was so in part because it presumed hierarchical relationships, not egalitarian relationships, within society. That was the normal way that most people certainly in Europe, but even lots of other places, that's the way people thought. And even more, the principle of sovereignty has changed over time. In Plantagenet, England, for example, back when, just before the Battle of Agincourt was fought, almost exactly 600 years ago, sovereigns basically owned their subjects, and there was no such thing as a modern national consciousness. Sovereignty vested in a person, in a dynasty, in a king. And it took a long time for the idea of national identity to develop in Europe. It took hundreds of years. And in the Middle East, because the historical predicates were simply different than they were in Europe, it was even later to develop. The national idea, again, as Dr. Berkey alluded to, the idea of defining oneself, identifying oneself by ethnic or ethno-national terms was really an early 20th century development in the Middle East. It wasn't until the Turks began to reformulate their own idea of their identity as more Turkish than Islamic that the Arabs then said, well, if the Turks are calling themselves Turks now instead of Muslims, then what are we? We're Arabs. And even though the Ottoman Empire treated the Arabs fairly harshly during the First World War, the idea in the mind of most Arabs in the Levant, in Syria and Iraq, geographical Palestine, the idea that they would form a separate nation defined by Arabness was an idea that was limited to aristocratic, salon-like culture before the 20th century. This is an idea that only develops really in the period just before the First World War, and then, of course, is accelerated by the war and by the intercession into that part of the world by Britain and France after the war. And the third sort of principle that I think covers here is that, in pre-modern times, earlier times, what the average person thought in the street, what the masses of people thought, didn't have a whole lot to do. I mean, public opinion, as it were, was not a huge motive force in the exchanges, the high political exchanges of great powers. But with an enormous shift in the normative environment of global politics in the 19th and the 20th centuries in particular, that changed. And what people think, the ideas of popular sovereignty spread around the world, if not necessarily mature democracy, they're not exactly the same thing. Rulers had to take into consideration what people thought more than they ever did, and that's partly because people became efficacious. They became more urban. They became more literate, including female literacy over time. They became simply more politically aware. What politics is, according to some political scientists, is the mobilization of consent, because you can't do everything by pure coercion, right? The kind of consent that you had to mobilize before populations became less passive was very modest compared to the kind of what you have to do to mobilize consent and to contain discontent or disconsent nowadays. So over the period of time we're talking about, one of the third thing that really is important and that changed is that the way that any political authority can govern coherently requires that it actually take into consideration what the masses of people think, whether it's a democracy informally or not in some cases. So these are all big changes that flow through this period from in the Middle East from before the First World War until we approach more modern times. Now, basically, since I don't have a great deal of, I don't have a couple hours to talk to you about this. What really, to me, the essence of understanding this process from the crumbling of empires to the creation of the modern Middle East is that the world kind of got caught between floors in what was an enormous normative shift in the 19th and the 20th centuries. And the war, as I've said, it was the accelerant that pushed it forward. And what the war did was it changed institutions a lot faster than attitudes changed. And again, let me just talk for a minute about the dialectical relationship between institutions and attitudes. They have to correspond in some way. The world is set, the political order, the social order is set up according to certain rules that most of us, unless we're really thinking about this every day, which would be weird, we take for granted. It's like second nature. All right. So you go and you vote, or you read the paper and you read about the Defense Department does all these kind of institutions that exist in our society, political and social. These are things we take for granted, but attitudes correspond to them. We understand the institutions because we have inculcated and we have integrated the rules that the institutions work by. Well, what happens when institutions change from on high? For example, when the British and the French come to the Levant and they create the territorial state, the concept of the Westphalian territorial state, the Weberian state, the modern state, and they stick it down on a region whose historical and attitudinal predicates have no connectivity to this new idea, right? What happens when there's a huge gap between institutions, which are associated with foreigners in many respects, and attitudes? What happens? Well, what happens, according to a lot of analysts of this phenomenon, is that you get hybrid, sort of strange, distorted forms of social and political change, hybrid and distorted and not necessarily stable forms of political order. There's a book by a brilliant Palestinian writer named Hisham Sharabi called Neo-Patriarchy. And he takes seriously this caught between floors character of the Arab world in about most of the 20th century. And he argues from a kind of a strange Marxian point of view to which I do not subscribe. But the basic idea is you have this traditional society that was buffeted from many, many directions, even long before World War I. If you want to date it, you can date it from the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt, 1799. That's a convenient point to date. Most people do that. Trying to cope with these pressures from outside, trying to get the traditional society, which in many countries, though not all, the great diversity in the region are tribal, segmentary lineages, as an anthropologist would describe it, trying to get the new institutions and the sort of the external ways of thinking about political order, trying to get the traditional social structure to align with that, turned out to be a very difficult thing to do in this period. So those are the three basic themes, the shadow belt idea, institutions and attitudes, that they have to be more or less, they have to align or correspond more or less if you're going to have a stable political order. And then the idea that you have a massive mobilization of large numbers of people politically, and that political order now depends not on just a small number of elite, but actually depends on a much broader social strata. Those are the three basic themes, I think, that come through. Now that I've done that and laid that out, let me go back and try to, in a little time that I have left, sort of tell you what happens. In a way, and I said before that there are intellectual, social, geopolitical, and technological elements to this story, and it's their interweaving that makes it interesting and makes it a challenge for teachers and students alike. There's another factor that comes to play often, and that is either happenstance or idiosyncratic foolishness. Now, obviously, the Ottoman Empire collapses in the First World War, and its Arab territories are taken away and divided from it because it entered the war. And we don't think much about it now, but it wasn't a foregone conclusion that the Ottoman Empire would enter the war on the side of the Central Powers. Most of the Committee for Union and Progress thought that remaining neutral would be a good idea, actually. But there were several leaders within the Cup, the most important being Enver Pasha, who had a different idea. Enver Pasha was a Germanophile. He was very much part of the interchange between the late Ottoman Empire and Germany. And he saw an opportunity in World War I to take revenge, as it were, and to improve the Ottoman Empire's position. First of all, vis-a Russia, which had been a traditional adversary for a long, long time, but also Britain. Enver Pasha had something to do with a negotiation between the Ottoman Empire and Britain that established the border between Egypt and Sinai, 1906. And Enver Pasha had been, I think humiliated is the wrong word, but let's put it this way. His attention had been arrested by the power of Britain to drive a conclusion to that negotiation in the way that the British wanted. And he was very concerned, and others in Turkey and Ottoman Empire were very concerned that with the consolidation of the British position in Egypt, starting in 1882, but really consolidated with the Anglo-French Entente of 1904, where the French basically said that Britain could have a special position in Egypt in return for Britain agreeing that the French could have a special position in Morocco. This is the way that the great powers used to trade off things back. Let me just tell you something else. I mean, just to give you a kind of flavor of what went on in the late 19th century, when the concert of Europe gave way to essentially just the balance of power, where the transactional rules were no longer as solid as they were. This was after the rise of the unification of Germany. In 1899, as part of a negotiation between Britain and Portugal, you don't usually hear much about the Portuguese Empire, right, when you talk about the Middle East. Okay. There was a secret codicil to an agreement which basically said, in the event of a war with Germany, Britain and Portugal would share Germany's colonies. This was part of an arrangement that goes back to 1373. It's the British-Portuguese treaty relationship is the oldest in the world. It's the longest living in the world. It goes back to Henry the Fourth or something. I don't even remember. The very next year, in 1900, as an offshoot of a negotiation between Britain and Germany over Samoa, okay, a secret codicil was added to that agreement, which said that in the event of a war with Portugal, Britain and Germany would split Portugal's colonies. Right? This is so the phrase perfidious Albion, doesn't mean nothing. This is the sort of thing that the British Foreign Ministry used to do in those days, Foreign Office used to do in those days. This is the kind of thinking that went on. And could you imagine that kind of thinking with Woodrow Wilson sitting in the room in Versailles? I mean, this is when I'm talking about this normative shift. And the reasons for the normative shift, I wish I had time to describe them, but I really don't. But let me just give you an example of what I'm thinking. I mean, Dr. Burke, you mentioned earlier about the effort by the British Navy to suppress the slave trade in the 19th century. Well, that's just Josiah Wilberforce and his allies trying to do that. Now, there's a lot of irony in the British effort to suppress the slave trade, because that's how it started, of course, as a kind of a very noble idealistic effort. But it ended up, of course, being father to the British colonization of West Africa, which we don't typically think of as an idealistic enterprise, but so be it. I've lost my train of thought, which I do sometimes. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Let me try to pick it up again. Slave trade, yeah. Well, now I don't want to talk about that. So let's flip now to the mandate system, which you all remember. The mandate system, which was applied to the Middle East, to Syria, to Iraq, Palestine, there were supposed to be halfway houses that took these countries or these nations from colonial status, or from being separated from Ottoman colonial status, to being free, independent nations, right? Well, when you think about the mandates, there's a huge amount of argument at the time and ever since. Were these really legitimately noble efforts to try to create, self-determination and independent states in the Middle East, or was this just a fig leaf for the extension of British and French colonialism, imperialism? And the answer is that there were several reasons why the Allied powers decided to carve up the Arab territories, the Ottoman Empire, and why they came to this idea of mandates instead of just the old-fashioned, colonial imperial intrigues, like I described the British-Portuguese and then the British-German arrangements of 1899-1900. How did that change? Oh, I remember now what I was going to say. The slave trade, the idea of abolishing the slave trade, I think has a logical relationship in some respects, though there are many, many sources, to the origins of, or the popularization of the idea of nationalism. Because after all, if people come to believe that it's wrong for individuals to be enslaved, it's not a huge leap to the conclusion that if individuals should not be enslaved, neither should entire peoples or nations. So I think there's a line of logical extension that gets you from the early part of the 19th century eventually to this idea of national self-determination, a change in again, the identity structure with which people thought of themselves, right? And that also had to do with modernity and the Protestant Reformation, and from that matter, the printing press, mass literacy, lots of reasons why nationalism rises up in the 19th century. But let's get back to, sort of what actually happens. So what happens is there are a series of agreements. And the essence of it is the Ottoman Empire is going to be destroyed in the sense all of its Arab territories are going to be taken away. Why? Again, not one reason, but I can think of at least three that various parts of the British and French and other European establishments thought. First of all, the Ottoman Empire's rescission over the previous century and so, it caused a lot of wars. It had given birth to countries like Romania and Bulgaria and Serbia, but it caused a lot of wars, not least the World War I in the minds of the European diplomats who were thinking about what would come after World War I, the Great War. So they figured if they would cut the Ottoman Empire down to size and agree on the dispersion of the territories, they would be able to avoid war amongst themselves over the vacuum created by the rescission of Ottoman power. That was one. Number two, a lot of people were idealist about it. These were the sort of the neocons, you might say, of the idealism armed, the neocons of that period, who actually really did believe in self-determination. If you've ever seen, Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, he's an example of a kind of a British romantic who really was like, went native, pro-Arab, and believed in, the independence of the Arabs. And there were people like that in the United States too, of course. There were some people like that in France and elsewhere in Europe. But it was mainly an Anglo-American phenomenon. And then there were the old-fashioned guys at the Foreign Office. Well, it's not often made explicit, but the competition for colonies outside of Europe, changed considerably the relations within powers inside of Europe. And it's best described as a kind of positional race. Now, you know what a positional race is because you've all probably studied or been exposed to the idea of an an arms race. Well, in an arms race, one side, or it could be bilateral, trilateral, quadrilateral arms race, one side or another tries to gain advantage, technological advantage, military advantage over the other, and the sides that stand to be inferior feel like they have to keep up. So how you assess your circumstances is context dependent, and the context is shaped by the leading power. Now, you have to think of the 19th century race for colonies in a way as a positional race, but not with regard to weapons only, though there was, of course, an arms race between Britain and Germany, but with respect to real estate. All right, real estate was finite. In Berlin in 1888, as you probably know, the European powers carved up sub-Saharan Africa. All right. Then after that, there was a kind of a race for colonies in the Pacific, Mariana Islands, Caroline Islands. Even Hawaii was implicated in this. I mean, the United States essentially did some pretty nasty things to take Hawaii, and I think it was 1893. But the feeling at the time among a lot of serious people was that if the United States didn't do it, then Germany or Japan would. So it was like, again, it's context-dependent sort of positional racing. You could think of it kind of like a risk board. You ever play Risk? Kind of a silly game. But, when you're starting out the game, you're putting your pieces on pretty soon you run out, right? I mean, the board's not infinite. The real estate's not infinite. So one of the things, again, not remarked on very much, that the powers decided, the Allied powers decided that they wanted to take the Arab territories of the Ottoman Empire because there wasn't any place else to take. They were running out of real estate. The world was pretty much divided up already. And the only really juicy stuff left were stuff that the Ottomans controlled, So it wasn't just one reason why the Ottoman Empire had to lose its Arab territories. There were several reasons that came together. Usually almost never the case that just one reason explains historically why a country does something. It's usually a bunch of things that come together. So people talk nowadays about Sykes-Picot. You hear this all the time, about the dissolution of the Sykes-Picot system. This is shorthand for a much more complicated set of arrangements that span several years. So let me just talk, as I'm sort of winding up here, let me just talk briefly about what that shorthand means. The first agreement among the Allies took place in 1915. It was the Constantinople Agreement, and this was the one that really involved Russia. And I sent out this map here. By the time, everybody get this? Okay. By the time the agreements, there were like 5 agreements, I think. By the time they started in 1915 and they ended in 1917, all during the war. By the time they finished, this is what the plan was, okay, to carve up the Ottoman Empire. All right, and you have a map of Sykes-Picot, right, already from the archive map already in your packet, right? These maps don't look alike. All right, so between the beginning of this process and the end of it, you have a lot of shifting about. So the first agreement really had to do, it was Britain, France, and Russia was to get Constantinople, Istanbul, the Dardanelles. You can sort of see, the map is self-explanatory. It was only later that you had the London Agreement. Let me see if I can get the exact dates for you. So Constantinople Agreement was March 18th, 1915. Then you have the Treaty of London, April 26th, 1915, and this adds Italy to the mix. This was the bribe that the powers offered to the Italians to join the war on the Allied side. So what do you give the Italians? Well, you can see on the map what the Italians claimed and what ended up. Sykes-Picot comes third in this series. Sykes-Picot is May 16th, 1916, and this was an adjustment of the earlier agreements just between Britain and France. That's where Sykes-Picot comes in. The adjustments were necessary for 2 reasons. One was General Allenby, a British general, had an army in Egypt ready to march north, just exactly as Enver Pasha had feared. Meanwhile, the French army was bogged down in the trenches of Europe. And so it was clear that British power was going to come to the Middle East a lot quicker than the French, if they ever got there at all. And so there were adjustments required, precisions. Right? That's what Sykes-Picot was. And then there was another agreement, Saint-Jean de Maurienne, April 17th, 1917, all right, which was really more between, again, the Italians come back into the picture. The Italians made certain demands. Some of the Italian demands would have come at the expense of Russia. So an agreement was made to expand the Italian domain, and also it has a little bit to do with the Greeks, but that's a sidebar. But the Russians had to agree to the renegotiation, as it were, of the Constantinople Agreement in 1970. Of course, the Russians didn't agree because the revolution took place. The Russians outed the whole secret negotiating history, and none of this ever entered into force. Now, when people say that the current Middle East is, the result of Sykes-Picot, this is really quite misleading. By the time the shooting stopped, by the time General Allenby was in Jerusalem, and by the time that Prince Faisal, was in Damascus, having declared an Arab kingdom, again, I could just watch Lawrence of Arabia, and you get the whole scene covered, right? It's a pretty accurate movie in some respects. By the time you get to 1920, Sykes-Picot is a totally dead letter. It's totally overtaken by events. So it's misleading to refer to the borders as the Sykes-Picot borders. Not true. The actual borders, after Versailles, there was a conference at San Remo in April of 1920. That's where the borders there was an attempt to draw preliminary borders, mainly between Britain and France, but the other powers were present as well, okay? So the borders are really San Remo borders, except as the borders align between Syria and Iraq and Turkey. Because what happened, as everybody knows, is that after the Treaty of Sèvres, where the Turks basically agreed to this amazing dismemberment, and this is not, look at this. This is not just a dismemberment of the Arab parts of the Ottoman Empire. This is a dismemberment of part of the Turkish majority parts of the Ottoman Empire, right? Basically, the Greeks made war on Turkey with British support, and the Turks fought back under Mustafa Kemal, Ataturk. They fought back. They organized themselves in guerrilla bands, and over time, they beat the hell out of the Greeks, sent them running, and the Brits as well. And so the whole thing was undone by force of arms. So Sykes-Picot was undone by force of arms, General Allenby, leading to San Remo, and then parts of the anticipated borders between the Arab world and Turkey were undone by another war, which led to the Treaty of Lausanne, 1923. And once that was agreed, and that was an interesting story too, once Lausanne was agreed, you had the borders pretty much set, at least as ran between Turkey and the Arab world. Some of the other borders in the region went on to be negotiated over many years. For example, there was a war between Saudi Arabia and Yemen over the province of Asir in 1934, so that border wasn't settled until after 1934. The border between Jordan and Syria wasn't finally settled until 1934, 1936. So this stuff took a long time to play out. And it wasn't finished in terms of these countries becoming independent. And by the way, I forgot, Alexandretta, Hatay province, the southernmost province in today's Turkey, used to be part of Syria. But as part of a deal in 1938, the French mandatory authorities gave it over to Turkey. And when the Russians overflew Turkish territory, not that that jet, they overflew Hatay province. Oh, that was not a coincidence, because they understand the history of that place, and they understand why, from the Syrian point, if you look at Syrian television, that it doesn't recognize Hatay as being part of Turkey. So when the Syrian TV gives the weather forecast for Syria, it includes Hatay. They've never acknowledged that Hatay should be part of Turkey. And meanwhile, as I said, you don't have the final sort of spilling out of all of these changes until 1971. That's the last independent Arab country, the United Arab Emirates, comes into existence in 1971 after the British withdrawal east of Suez, right? So, and really doesn't really congeal until even a few years after that. So they have this long period of time before the so-called modern Middle East comes into play. So the idea that somehow these are just Sykes-Picot borders is really a mistake. Finally, last point. It's also a mistake to think that it's the interstate system that is decaying. Of course it is, but it's more. I think it's more useful to understand, for all the reasons that we've talked about, and ones you'll hear about later, and ones that we heard before from Dr. Berkey. The whole identity construct in the region is in flux to some extent. It's the states themselves. It's these Westphalian units, these territorial entities that were imposed on the region after World War II that are disintegrating. So that's the real phenomenon. Four Arab states no longer exist: Iraq, Syria, probably Yemen, and Libya. All right. Yemen might be put back together again. I don't know. The other three I really doubt, and there are probably more to come. All right. So it's the units themselves that are disintegrating, because the gap between institutions and attitudes has never really been completely made up. And the destruction of the state system is the epiphenomenon. It's the consequence, not the cause, of the current mayhem in the region. So there's a fundamental misunderstanding here. It's going to get in the causal arrows backwards. It's the state structures themselves that are disintegrating, and that has led to the instability in the sort of broader regional system, not the other way around. So I'll stop there. We have time for. Do I have to turn this off?
It's like 15. No. Okay, we're open for questions. Wait till the microphone comes to you. We'll start with Mark Yanaway. And if you could state your name and school when you ask your question, that would be good.
Mark Yanaway, Wamogo High School, Litchfield, Connecticut. So I want you to talk to us about the role oil plays, like the British grabbing Mosul and et cetera, in the disintegration of borders and the reintegration of the states, if you could, please.
Yeah, everybody that asks a good question gets a copy of the magazine. I brought a bunch, so if you pass that back, please. I figured I might need an incentive to get you to ask questions. Oil, yeah, well, like I say, there are lots of factors in the mix, and there always have been. Mosul was originally going to be part of the French zone. If you look at Sykes-Picot maps, that was adjusted later on. But the French got a special sort of concession in the oil business in Mosul, so there was a kind of a quid pro quo. Oil started to matter right around the time of World War I, because that's when naval ships switched from coal-fired to oil-fired power. But oil only really became strategic commodity of the scale we know it, in our lifetime, really after World War II, when the industrial plants of a recovering Europe and the sort of nascent industrial capacities of East Asia became oil-fired. That's when the consumption of oil really, really expanded. That's when the exploration, that's when the companies became a big deal. So you have this sort of a two-phase evolution of the importance of oil, it mattered back at the, in World War I and the end of World War I. When Churchill understood it, he was colonial secretary, then Lord of the Admiralty, and other European elites, military elites, understood the coming importance of oil. But it wasn't a huge economic factor inside these countries. That was no longer the case in 1945, 46, when the United States, really enmeshed itself for the first time in the region through oil in Saudi Arabia. All right, and the Anglo-American Oil Company in Iran. All of these things began to take on a much greater significance, really during and in the wake of World War II. So there's this two-stage phase of how oil becomes important. In the region itself, of course, there's an uneven distribution of oil revenues, and a lot of people, including a fellow named Ross, who recently wrote a really pretty good book called The Oil Curse, has shown how oil has actually been a great plague on the countries that have it. This is an elaboration of a thesis that goes back to Lisa Anderson many years ago. I make the very simple point. In order for citizenship to develop in a way that we consider to be constructive and normal, there has to be a relationship between the government and the people, in the sense that the government taxes the people, and in return, the government provides services. If you invert that, all right, if the government gets its revenue not from taxes, but from selling commodities, then you have a distorted relationship between the government and the people, and you don't have the normal sort of flow of citizenship and responsibilities that we understand in most Western countries. And that, in fact, has been the case. There has been a distorted phenomenon. It has been a kind of a curse. And it's kind of ironic that, so for one of the most successful countries in the Middle East, when it comes to building the three things that actually make a modern country function right: human capital, social trust, and institutional coherence. That's the trifecta. That's what makes a modern country work. Jordan is pretty successful, but it has no oil. All right. So there's an example of how the oil wealth can be distorted and cause more trouble than it's worth. Now, in the broad international system, one could talk a long time about this. It's an important factor. Because of fracking, the United States needs less oil from abroad. A revolution, by the way, that if you'd asked people 25 years ago, they would have said, you must have fallen out of a tree and hit your head, or you're crazy, you're a combination platter missing a taco or something. But it happened, right? It happened. But that doesn't mean that oil still isn't very important, and important to the United States. If the United States thinks that it is a provider of global security goods, then it's the condition of the international economy as a whole that matters to us. So we may not need the oil, but others do, including the poorest countries in the world. The price matters. And oil is an integrated market. There's one international price, right? Not like the gas market, for example. So that even if we have a lot of our own oil, if the price is whatever it is because of a shortage or a revolution in Nigeria, that price is also reflected here in the United States. So it's complicated politically. Right now, also, oil has been and it is again a weapon, but not in the old-fashioned way, like use oil as a weapon against the United States because it supports Israel and stuff like that. We have a different phenomenon, right? Back during the end of the Cold War, Saudi Arabia basically flooded the oil market, drove the price down in order to hurt the Soviet Union. And it did. And now it's doing it again to hurt Russia. So it's a very complicated question, is what I'm trying to indicate here, and I can't give you more than that as an answer. Mike? Oh. Oh, but really, I schlepp these things here from Washington, and I don't want to have to schlepp them back, Besides, it's a good magazine. You need the American, just like you need Orbis in order to do your jobs.
I was wondering, how distinct was the Kurdish identity at the end of World War I? And if so, why was there no consideration for separate mandate for them?
Well, that's a great question. It actually comes together. There were two ethnicities that sort of fell out of the Ottoman Empire. That were not Arab, but that the Allies at Versailles and afterwards considered to be worthy in given the Wilsonian concept of self-determination. One were the Kurds and the other were the Armenians, of course. Now, the Armenian situation, again, we could talk for an hour about that, so complicated that was. But before a certain point in the war, in other words, before the Turkish resurgence that led to the Treaty of Lausanne, there was a consideration of a mandate for Armenia. And you'll be surprised to hear, perhaps, that the the most likely mandatory authority for Armenia would have been the United States. Now, of course, that never happened because, again, it was overtaken by events on the field of battle. But the Armenians were represented at Versailles. And there was going to be, people thought there was going to be an independent Armenia. Essentially, there had been a rump Armenia that had come out of the Soviet Revolution and Civil War, when for a temporary period of time, the young Soviet Union had lost the Caucasus. There was something called the Transcaucasus Federated Republic, which came into existence. There was a briefly independent Georgia, a briefly independent Armenia in a rump section. When, due to the tumult of the collapse of the Ottoman authority, an Armenian state seemed to be coming into existence. At a certain point before Luzon, Turkey and the Soviet Union agreed together to invade and destroy and to partition Armenia. That's what happened, okay? And by the way, in Armenian politics today, there's a kind of a bimodal divide, and in a way it kind of depends on how Armenians think about that joint Turkish-Soviet destruction of their infant country. Now the Kurds did not have the same, in the minds of the Western officials at the time, British, French, American, and others, the Kurds didn't have a national definition as distinct as the Armenians. And there are lots of reasons for that, which we won't go into, but autonomy for the Kurds was on the agenda at Versailles. And there was a territorial delineation of where this autonomous region would be, okay? But again, Ataturk's, Mustafa Kemal's attitude toward the modern Turkish Republic was one essentially based on it was kind of a French model of homogeneous, but universal but homogeneous ethnic constituency, and that's what the Turks insisted on in the lead up to the Luzon Treaty. And so anybody that wasn't a Turk couldn't have an autonomous zone, couldn't have a kind of a carve out, and so they simply muffled the Kurds. And of course, the Kurds were divided then as now. They were not just in Turkey, but they were also in Iran, also in Syria, also in Iraq. And so they really weren't once the borders were getting drawn, they really weren't situated to coordinate and implement a national movement. And their consciousness had not gotten to the point where they thought of themselves as a single nation dispersed in 4 countries. Now that's changing. And I would say one of the most important developments we see before our eyes now in the Middle East is the coalescence of Kurdish nationalism. And it's going to change the map dramatically. And just about 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 years behind them, I don't really know, I'm not a prophet, the same thing is happening in North Africa with the Amazigh, with the Berbers. You are beginning to see, at a lag of about a decade, the rise of an Amazigh national consciousness in North Africa that will in one day totally transform Algeria and in a slightly different way Morocco, which have huge percentages of Berber populations. So it's a very good question, and I wish I could give you a more definitive answer. But I mean, the answer is yes. Armenians and Kurds had a special status, but their goals were overtaken by events on the field of battle. One anecdote, if I may. The Turkish representative to the Luzon Conference was İsmet İnönü. İsmet İnönü ended up being the successor to Ataturk when Ataturk died in 1938. Inonu must have taken a lesson from Trotsky at Brest-Litovsk in the way that he conducted himself at Luzon. Basically, he came and he presented the Turkish position at Luzon, which was that wherever there was a Turkish ethnic majority, that territory should be part of the new Turkish Republic. All right? And the British representative was none other than the great Lord Curzon. All right? And when Curzon began to leather-lung his way into the hall, Inonu, who was already pretty much deaf and who had a kind of a primitive hearing aid, just turned off his hearing aid. So Curzon would sit there and bloviate for an hour, and then after he was finished, Inonu would turn his hearing aid back on and simply read once more what he had read before. Can you imagine? So there's some humor in all this, not much, but a little bit of humor in all this. Yes?
Hi, Brian Harding. I teach history at Mott Community College in Flint, Michigan. I wanted to pull back to a comment you just made in regards to economic competition between Russia and Saudi Arabia, which frankly I hadn't given thought to until very recently. Thank you. I read a piece, I can't remember who wrote it recently, who made an argument for the reason why Putin put his Russian soldiers in Syria very recently is not So not only because to prop up a client state in Assad or to hold on to a Russian naval base, but that it had to do with continuing instability in that country to prevent a Saudi Arabian oil pipeline to Europe. Does that sound valid?
No.
Okay.
That's actually pretty sounds pretty fanciful to me. I don't want to get into a long discussion of contemporary events because this is a history institute. But let me just very briefly say that as in Ukraine, in Syria, you can think of Russian ambitions as three concentric circles, sort of like Matryoshka dolls, nested inside of each other. There's a sort of a minimalist defensive objective in each case. There's an interim or mid-range objective, and then there's a stretch goal, all right, in each case. And I don't want to do this at length, but the inner concentric circle in Syria is basically the defense of the only ally that Russia has. And Tartus, the only base outside of Russian territory where the Russian military can operate, which makes it, clingingly anyway, a Mediterranean power, and does so relative to the United States because we have ceased to become a significant Mediterranean power. We don't have a carrier in the Med anymore. That's the state of our Navy right now, just parenthetically. The stretch goal, which may or may not be true, speculative of course, is Putin is basically KGB light. That's his brain. That's how he thinks. And he grew up all through his career basically thinking of Western institutions as the enemy of the Soviet Union and today continue also with Russia. Western institutions and the values that they embody. The two institutions in particular that Putin believes are most dangerous to the continuation of his regime and to in his imagination, Russian political culture are NATO and the European Union, for reasons that I shouldn't need to explain. So the outer brass ring in Ukraine is to destroy NATO by forcing it to come to the defense of some NATO country. They can consolidate Ukraine and send little green men into Lithuania, and then see what the Europeans and the Americans do in response. If we don't do anything, if we simply remain passive to that kind of a thing, that's the end of NATO. All right. If we do something, it could bring on the Third World War, a nuclear war, which is not exactly so it's a risky thing, and I don't think that Putin will do that unless he's pretty sure of a very supine Western response. But that's the brass ring. In the case of Syria, what's been happening? The war has created more than 4 million refugees, and if the Russians continue, the Russians have been flying more sorties in one day than we've flown in a month. All right, they're going to make everything much worse. They're either going to suppress the civil war like they did in Chechnya in a very brutal way, or they're not going to be able to, and I frankly doubt they're going to be able to. And the result will be more blood, more refugees, and look what it's doing to the European Union. It's destroying the EU. On top of the Euro crisis, which created a north-south divide, now the migrant crisis is creating an east-west divide, and the European Union is a lot weaker than a lot of people think. And now finally, after all the years of the people in Brussels deciding how much butterfat could be in chocolate, now you've got a situation where the core issues of sovereignty are at stake, right? The constituency of your own community, your money, all right, and fundamental security issues, like basically terrorist threats that are coming into Europe on the wings of these migrants, these asylum migrants. So now you've got core security, core sovereignty issues at stake, and you can already see the direction the EU is going. It's going away from further integration and expansion and back toward the national unit. So that's what I think the Russians are doing. There's an intermediate goal, I think, in Syria right now, and it simply has to do with reasserting the Russian position in the region at the expense of the United States for its own sake. For its own sake. Putin still remembers the expulsion of the Russians from Egypt in 1972 as a result of some very shrewd American diplomacy. And he wants to reverse that. And he sees nothing but weakness now in the United States and in Western Europe. And it's simply the way, it's gamesmanship. It's the way that Putin still thinks. He still thinks in terms of 19th century geopolitics. He still thinks in terms of what I mentioned before, positional competitions. That's the way he thinks. So fine, most statesmen in the world think like that. Our president doesn't, but most people do. All right? So they want to play that game. If we don't, guess who wins? I mean, I'm not sure what the Russians would win in Syria. Right. Sometimes I want to say, you want it? Be my guest, But that's another story.
Thank you.
Here I'm migrating toward the speaker here because I have this magazine.
Oh,
You already
thank
have
you.
one? No, it's behind you.
No, it's behind me. My question is, I guess going back to the end of the Great War, you previously talked about the Kurds and the Armenians. What role did the Persians, the Iranians sort of play in the margins of this, and kind of see where they sit now as this dissolution of this state system that was created?
That's a really good question. It leads actually to a larger question that I wanted to address, but my lecture was terrible and ran out of time. Iran was never colonized in the way that, for example, the British colonized Sierra Leone, or the French colonized Guinea. The skein of Iranian sovereignty was never completely severed. There was penetration of the country by the British and by the Russians and by others, and it was a very weak country. What basically happened was before World War I, the Qajar dynasty was overthrown by the Pahlavi. It was kind of a military coup, Reza Shah, and Reza Shah set about trying to modernize the country again along sort of quasi-European lines, and so the borders of Iran were never in flux. Iran did not participate in any significant way in the fighting in World War I. So there was positioning, Russian and British positioning around it, just like in World War II, where Iran was essentially divided between American and Russian spheres for purposes of basing and fighting in other places. But there wasn't a lot of military action going on in Iran, Persia during the first. So it was kind of off to the side. And as far as I can remember, at Versailles, not a great deal of attention got paid. I mean, it's sort of like the wheel that squeaks gets the grease. The Iranian wheel, in the context of a huge mess after the conclusion of the First World War, the Iranian wheel wasn't squeaking a whole lot, so it really didn't play a central role. It didn't, for example, play anywhere near as much of a role as Palestine. It's a tiny little area. I didn't even mention Palestine. And I probably should say that as all these various factors played out, they played out a little bit differently in every place. For example, the Palestine mandate wasn't a Class A, a Class B, or a Class C mandate. It was a mandate unto itself. And the reason was because the principle of self-determination didn't fit it because of the Balfour Declaration. Okay? So there are all these little eccentricities that applied to given circumstances. But Iran, I mean, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I don't remember huge chapters in the books the history books that describe Iran. Now, of course, after the region sort of begins to take shape, again, the British have a lot of interest in Iran. They have a lot of commercial interest in Iran. Again, the Anglo-American Oil Company. They have decent relations with Reza Shah. But then, as you approach the Second World War in the 1930s, things don't go so hot. Okay. In 1936, Reza Shah changes the name of the country from Persia, which is, of course, a Western applied name. Persia comes from Fars, which was the first province the Greeks hit back during the time of the Trojan War, for all I know. That's how the word Persia comes into existence. Changed it to Iran. And Iran is a version of Aryan. And Reza Shah was very much attracted to the master race theory of the Nazis because he thought he was in, Iran and the Caucasus, that was the seedbed of the Aryan master race. So Reza Shah was very much flattered, and he became very, sort of pro-German, which led to his deposition. And whence the occupation of the country, essentially by Russians in the north and Americans in the south. And that's how his son, the Shah that we know, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, right, comes into being, becomes the Shah afterwards. So it's a very interesting story. And of course, Iran plays a huge role in regional politics after World War II. But back around the time of the First World War, not so much, not so critical, it seems to me. I see a hand. Could you guys pass this back, please, to the questioner?
Thank you. Yassine Benzinan from the Hill School, Pottstown, Pennsylvania. And my question is about a phenomenon that is happening right now in Arab TV, Arab radio, Arab society in general. You can't help it but hear about the concept of constructive chaos.
Yeah.
Is it something that should be relegated to conspiracy theory realm, or does
Yeah,
it have any scholarly merit?
No,
Yeah.
well, let's put it this way. This is a remark, this idea of constructive chaos, was a remark that Condoleezza Rice made back in 2005 or something. I don't think I was, I mean, I also wrote speeches for Condi early on in her time as Secretary of State, but not for very long. I think she must have hatched that remark after I was already out of the 7th floor. But, you know, people say things in American government that they probably shouldn't say. But all she meant, I mean, President Obama said something actually fairly similar to that in an interview with, I think it was either Jacob Goldberg or David Remnick a couple of years ago, where he said, well, you know, if the Saudis, for example, and some of our Arab allies in the Gulf are a little uncomfortable about American policy, especially American policy with regard to Iran, the president said, well, you know, they need to get used to change, right? That did not help matters in Saudi Arabia. It just contributed to yet another laundry problem in Riyadh. But so now there's this theory that there's going to be, a second Sykes-Picot. You hear about this all the time, right? So that the West is going to come in again, and it's going to redraw borders, and it's going to issue new rules to the regional states. And you know, I'm going to grow wings and fly around the room before anything like that happens. I mean, for the Arab street to imagine that the West is desirous or capable of doing such a thing right now, as a West, as it were, it's hysterical, really. It's funny because it's just so far from the truth. There's not a Western government I can think of that wants to do anything except run in an otherly direction from the Middle East. The idea that we have the capacity or the will or the wisdom to go in and redesign the entire state system, So what's it going to look like if there's no such thing as a deliberate policy of, well, first of all, this shows that a lot of Arabs think of themselves as victims, as helpless, as totally at the mercy of external forces. And this is a pathology. This is a bad thing. Because with people who deliberately give up their freedom like that, give up their capacity to change their lives on their own behalf. And nothing is going to improve in this region in general until some Arabs somewhere in some new generation take their circumstances into their own hands and fix it. Because we don't know how. Western countries don't know how to create viable institutions in the Arab world. It's a different part of the world. We don't really credit their otherness. We don't really credit the differences of their history, and we don't accord them the dignity of difference. All right? We have this universalist idea that that best practice in government and economics fell out of the sky one day in the 18th century, and it applies to everybody. And this is, of course, wrong. It's a nice for applause line in American politics, but it's wrong. So they're going to have to take their own circumstances into their own hands. And until that happens, what we're going to see is a multi-generational long mess in the region. No one's going to come and help them out, unless they want the Russians, of course, to settle all their differences. That's not going to happen either. So there was a time in the Middle East. I mean, I defer to the historians here, but there was a time between the rescission of the Mongol armies from the Levant after the Battle of Ain Jalut, what was it, 1303 or whatever it was, beginning of the 14th century, until the Ottomans come in 1517. You got a period there of about 100. What is that? Do the math. 175. The region was pretty much a mess during that period. It was sort of like gray zone non-governments. There were governments in large cities and so forth, but it was a pretty difficult time. Not a lot of coherence, not a lot of security for trade. If you really want an analogy for what the next several years might look like, you're going to go back to between 1310 and 1517 to that, and then you'll see what it. Obviously things are different, but no one's going to come and bail them out. There's no new Western conspiracy. There's no new Sykes-Picot, and there won't be. There's no new Congress of Berlin. There won't be. Anybody else? I got more magazines. Well, thank you very much. No, there's one more. Where?
Thank you. In my class, and I'm not sure if you support this notion, I kind of try to diminish this whole notion about artificiality of Sykes-Picot borders, and you already demolished this whole myth of Sykes-Picot in the first place by this whole notion that, well, all of it has to do with artificial borders imposed by colonial powers in the post-World War I Middle East. That's a myth, correct? I mean, borders were artificial in one part of that world,
Yeah.
and that's the Levant and Iraq, Syria.
Yeah, I think that's
The rest of it, not really.
Well, you have to go case by case, but basically you're right. There is a sort of a natural history to a lot of those borders. There are really, I'd say there are really 4 countries in the region that have, solid pre-Islamic identities as I'll call them proto-nations. Right? Egypt, obviously. The Tigris-Euphrates, so Mesopotamia goes back to Babylon, although how exactly that dices out today is a little bit complicated because of sectarian problems and so forth. Morocco, I think, qualifies as an integral entity, and I think you could argue that Yemen does too. And all of these sort of like antique proto-nations got that way largely because of geography. In the rest of the region, you have to really go case by case to talk about artificiality or non-artificiality. The border between Iraq and Syria, because it splits tribal groupings, is pretty artificial. The border between Saudi Arabia and Iraq, pretty artificial. The border between Jordan and Syria, they're pretty artificial. But so are the borders of modern Libya. All right, Libya was created essentially by an Italian operation in 1911. In 1951, Libya first became an actual state under Senussi rule, King Idris the first and only. That lasted until September 1st, 1969, when Gaddafi comes along. But when the trouble broke out in Libya in 2011, I was on a Navy ship at the time. That's not important. And there was going to be this massacre in Benghazi, which has since been shown to be probably not true. But the people in the White House and in the government who were urgently in favor of a Western intervention, including a U.S. cruise missile, sort of on-ramp to the intervention, I don't think had ever heard the term Cyrenaica before, or Tripolitania, or Fezzan. They knew nothing about this country, all right? Libya really was a very artificial country. Tunisia, much less so, because Tunisia is a kind of a city-state, given where people live. And Tunisia has a unique history. Somebody mentioned before about the diversity, again, Dr. Berkey, the diversity in this part of the world. Of course, it's all true. In a lot of countries, Muslim countries, Arab countries, the law was that women had to veil themselves. There was only one Arab country where the law was just the reverse, that women were not allowed to veil themselves, and that was Tunisia. Now, why was that? There are lots of reasons to explain the Tunisian exception, but one remote reason that not a lot of people seem to know about is that that sort of purplish deep red hat with the little tassel on it, right? It's called a shashia, all right? These were back in Ottoman times. These were largely made in Tunis. They were made in a couple places, but Tunis was that's where the guild was that made these hats. Where did they get the wool? They got the wool by trading across the Med with Europeans. So very, very, very early on, 1500s, even earlier, they had a cosmopolitan trading relationship with Europe. They knew Europe better than the Bay in Algiers and so on. So there are these remote historical reasons why there are different developmental trajectories. So artificial, yeah, it really depends on where you're. Look at the UAE, which used to be the Trucial States, right? When the British that's pretty artificial, it seems to me. Qatar, it's a family with a flag. So in a way, it's not artificial. It's not artificial in a part of the Middle East, especially if it's very tribal still in terms of social structure. But in terms of a territorial state, it's pretty artificial. The border between Oman and Yemen, I mean, that's just a straight line. Whenever you see a straight line, as opposed to a line that contours around a river or a mountain range, you kind of go, wait a minute, who drew that one? So, I mean, you're right, but you got to take it case by case. Yeah. Could you pass that back, please?
Do you want to talk a little bit about Ibn Saud? Now, he was not really, was he involved at all at Versailles? The Lawrence of Arabia movie shows, of course, that Prince Faisal was the Hashemite. He was the leader of the Arab revolt. But can you talk about the relationship between Prince Faisal and Ibn Saud?
Well,
and
that's a really great question, and I'm actually sort of sorry you asked it this late in the because I could talk for a long. This is really fun stuff, right? But I want to mention one thing. Somebody asked a question before about slavery, the end of I think it was you, the end of slavery in the Muslim world. Well, there's a famous story about, I think it was in 1945. I mean, I could be remembering this totally wrong. Ibn Saud comes to New York City on a visit, and he goes to the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. And with him, accompanying him, is a very large black man who is his slave, his personal property. They are the best of friends. They've known each other since they were kids, all right? Guess what? The Waldorf Astoria will not seat the black man. Now, I think that's an interesting illustration of something that Dr. Berkey was trying to explain about how complicated these relationships are. Maybe this is an apocryphal story, but if it is, it should be real. It's so wonderful. Ibn Saud was from Nejd. Okay, this is a part of, if I had a map, part of Saudi Arabia, kind of like up and over there, you know, like where Riyadh is today. You know the map, right? Of course, this is a part of Arabia that's, you know, that at the time, before the Second World War, and even going back a little earlier, pretty primitive. People were nomads. Weren't a lot of big cities. Literacy wasn't very high. Oil hadn't become critically important early on. The Hashemites and the House of Saud were not friendly. But the House of Saud, the Al Saud, were not friendly also with other families on the Arabian Peninsula. In Khayl, the Rashidis, others, there was a lot of competition in Arabia going back a long, long time. What basically happened is, in the 1700s, there was a deal made between the Al Saud and the Ibn Wahhab. The Wahhabs being a preacher, sort of revitalization movement, if you take the anthropological literature into consideration here, Anthony Wallace, that kind of stuff. And what they did was they recapitulated what Muhammad had done earlier on. The power of a religious idea to unify the squabbling and warring tribes of Arabia. And that created a consolidated political entity in Nejd, just in Nejd. Now, in 1924, all right, what happens is the Nejdi armies invade the Hijaz. They make war on it, and they come to Mecca, Medina, and they win. All right, and they kick the Hashemites who'd been resident, and they kick them out. By that time, Sharif Hussein, I think, was already dead, and his eldest son Ali was the Sharif. He ended up going into exile in Egypt. And when they came in, when the warriors came in, they destroyed a lot of tombs and shrines and things like that because they were against shirk, they were against idolatry. I mean, they did kind of the same things in parts of the Hijaz. They did, like, for example, there were an exhibition of Muhammad's tooth or Muhammad's. They destroyed all these shrines, most of these shrines. What they did was not that dissimilar to what the Islamic State guys are doing. The Tawhidis, the Unitarians, anti-iconography. What they were doing in Palmyra, what the Taliban did in Bamiyan. They're destroying all of these relics because they think it's idolatry. So that was the kind of very radical literalist movement. But the Saudi Arabia didn't become known as, then it became the unified kingdom of Nejd and the Hijaz. It wasn't renamed Saudi Arabia as we know it today. I think it was 1932. And then 2 years later, it made war against Yemen and stole a seer from the Yemenis. So they were no friends of the Hashemites at all, of Faisal and Abdullah. On the contrary, now over the years, after Nasser comes along, the monarchies in the region kind of see a common interest. So the Jordanians, Hashemite monarchy in Jordan, and the Saudis get kind of friendly, okay? But it's an interesting relationship because King Hussein, the late King Hussein, used to go to the Hijaz from time to time. You know why? Because his family still had property there. They owned land because when the Saudis came in, they didn't expropriate all the land that privately owned land. So the family had land in the Hijaz. So they had the two monarchies had this kind of wary relationship between them, but they increasingly cooperated as the Nasserites and the pro-Soviet and the sort of the so-called progressive secular type regimes began to pose a threat to them in the 1950s and 60s. So that's kind of the history of the Hashemite Ibn Saud in a nutshell, very small nutshell, of the Hashemite Ibn Saud relationship.
And with that, we'll have to bring this to a close. Join me in thanking Adam Garfinkle.